Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Todd Kimball, and it is an honor to be your MC today. Prior to our official meeting, we had a half hour of lively music, as well as a few of us had a chance to get to know our presenter today, and she is lively and engaging. You guys are in for a real treat this morning. I will keep my remarks short as we are getting started a couple of minutes late, but as a reminder, humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. And backed by popular demand for an encore, Mr. Pete and Paul Barquette.
Shadows are falling and I'm running out of breath. Keep me in your heart for a while. If I leave you, it doesn't mean I love you any less. Keep me in your heart for a while. When you wake up in the morning and you see that crazy sun, keep me in your heart for a while. There's a train leaving nightly call when all is said and done. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sometimes when you're doing simple things around the house, maybe you'll think of me and smile. You know I'm tied to you like the buttons on your blouse. Keep me in your heart for a while. Hold me in your thoughts, take me to your dreams, touch me as I fall into view. When the winter comes, keep the fires lit, and I will be right next to you. Engine drivers heading north to Pleasant Stream, keep me in your heart for a while. You know these wheels keep turning, but they're running out of steam. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. Sha-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Keep me in your heart for a while. Keep me in your heart for a while.
Pete and Paul Barquette. Polly commented in the chat earlier on this, but the sound has never been better. And that is thanks in large part to the talent of our artists, but also our audio-visual team of Dave DiNucci, Mike Brochet, and Jeff Strang over there at the Friendly House. So thank you, everybody. Sounding fantastic today. Environmental passion runs in the family of our speaker, Lindsay Cornelius. Her father was both a founding board member of the Columbia Land Trust, as well as AmeriCorps. After completing her degree in environmental science at Western Washington University, Lindsay had lofty ambitions to do exciting work in exotic places. So she is surprised 20 years later to find herself still working for an organization she volunteered for as a young girl and landing so close to home. She learned one important lesson in her years caring for the natural areas from the Pacific Ocean to the East Cascades. There are more delightful surprises and intriguing mysteries in our backyards than we could exhaust in a lifetime. She has worn many hats at the Columbia Land Trust, from field assistant to volunteer coordinator to restoration project manager and strategic planner. She currently serves as manager of the East Cascades Oak Partnership, a collaboration of 25 tribal, federal, state, and local organizations working to implement a strategic plan for the Oregon white oak conservation in the Gorge and East Cascades. Let's have a rousing ovation from those live at the Friendly House and a warm yet muted ovation from our Zoom audience for Lindsay Cornelius.
Thank you. That was a lovely welcome. And everyone can hear me okay. I get a thumbs up from the Zoom audience. All right. Well, as Todd mentioned, my name is Lindsay Cornelius, and I am the East Cascades Oak Partnership Manager for Columbia Land Trust. And I'm really excited to be here with you remotely from my home in White Salmon this morning. Columbia Land Trust is a nonprofit land conservation organization. We conserve and care for the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Columbia River region through sound science and strong relationships. And I'm going to tell you more about how we do that. But before I do, I wanted to give you a little bit more information about who I am. So I grew up in Vancouver, Washington with my mom, Lori, and on a farm in Ridgefield, Washington with my dad, Terry. So I got to keep 1 foot in suburbia where all my friends were and 1 foot on the farm where my soul was, and maybe partly still is. These are my 3 boys, Lyle, Finn, and Chase, and my dog, Bear. And it is my deepest joy to spend time outdoors with those boys and my husband, who I will introduce later. So why all the family? For me, I can't separate the story of Columbia Land Trust from the story of my life. So though it might be a little bit of an indulgence on my part, I'm not even going to try. Okay. These are my kiddos right here and my dog, Bear. And as I mentioned before, I will introduce my husband later. So as I mentioned, why all the family? For me, I really can't separate the story of the land trust from the story of my life. There it was again in living color. So in the land trust emerged in the early 1990s at a time of rampant growth in Clark County, Washington, that was eroding agriculture and forest land and streams and wetlands. And the founders, a small group of people alarmed by those changes, wanted to provide an alternative to regulation or to litigation, and began imagining themselves adopting a voluntary conservation mechanism that was catching on in the late 80s and 90s, land trusts. So let's enjoy a little blast from the past here.
The Land Trust has been in the formative stages for the last year or so. Well, last night was its formal coming out party, complete with a membership drive. And
so right there on the bottom right, that blonde head is mine. I was volunteering to check in our guests, and my grandfather's walking through the door, and that's my brother, Tyler, in the corner. And this person right here who's not well viewed is Dr. Robert Michael Pyle, who's a wonderful author, lives in the Grays River, Washington, and is a lepidopterist, and has written some incredible books about monarchs and also Bigfoot. He wrote a natural history of Bigfoot.
Raising auction too. Spokesman Bronson Potter tells Newswatch 25 the sole purpose of this nonprofit.
This tall, lanky person over here is Glenn Lamb. He was our executive director for 36 years, just recently retired at the beginning of this year. And then this person over here is my dad, Terry Cornelius, who, as I mentioned, is a founding board member. And then I'm just going to scoot ahead here. This video just cracks me up because the technology, but this is still our phone number, but now you have to add the 360 in the front because there's so many more people who live in our region. So that's just fun little blast from the past there. After I graduated from college, I was kicking around Bellingham and Seattle doing seasonal work when my dad called with an idea. The land trust had an AmeriCorps position that it was struggling to fill, and he wondered if I might be interested. And I loved my family and my home, but as Todd mentioned, I was in my early 20s. That was a time for fledging, and the idea of coming home was a tough one. But after talking with Ian Sinks, our stewardship director, who's this tall, lanky person over here, I thought, that sounds like an incredible opportunity, and I can do anything for a year. So I accepted the position, and it was the best decision of my life. We were small then. There were just 7 of us pitching in with all the events, outreach, the fundraising, and our individual work. So I came on in 2002, just a couple of years after the Land Trust had decided to really throw itself into hiring staff and becoming more of a regional land trust. And by that time, we'd grown from working on small 10 to 20 acre conservation easements in Vancouver to owning and managing several 100-acre properties on the Grays River toward the coast and on the Klickitat River east of the gorge. And so Ian and I got to travel and take care of those incredible places. And we got to build a stewardship program from the ground up. And we knew science was foundational, that our ability to earn the trust of communities we worked in would be based in large part on how we managed the land we conserved, and that we were taking on a responsibility to our donors and to Columbia Land Trust and to the incredible resources that we were tasked with caring for. And so over time, we did that. I had a degree in environmental science, but the practical education I got from working with Ian doing projects like trap netting juvenile salmon in tributaries on the lower Columbia, and pulling and spraying weeds, planting trees, burning abandoned buildings on islands in the middle of the Columbia, doing prescribed burns in fire-adapted oak woodlands, counting snails in streams, assisting with major tidal wetland restoration projects. That's what the helicopter is all about. And the learning was just phenomenal. And as I gained confidence in my own ability to manage projects, I got to take the lead on projects like the removal of 8 miles of paved road from the Klickitat River floodplain, which took more than a decade to complete across 6 different phases of construction. And I can tell you there is nothing more powerful to me than the healing effects of restoration, to use my mind and my physical body and my time to help create conditions that might allow more fish to spawn, or more pollinators to pollinate, or more carbon to be captured from our warming atmosphere. It's really powerful stuff. And the Land Trust has invested its efforts in the concept of restoring ecological integrity to the landscape, the processes that govern and create habitat, rather than focusing mostly on enhancement projects, which are projects that can be really important, but function more like Band-Aids. Kind of like the difference between building a fish ladder or removing a dam. Sometimes those processes are fires, like in oak woodlands or pine savanna. Sometimes those processes are successional, just development that lead to things like old growth forests. And sometimes those processes are natural fluctuations in how water flows over a floodplain. And so I want to take just a few minutes to watch another video, this one about the Haul Road restoration project that I mentioned on the Klickitat River. And apologies, there's more family. So I'm going to drag this video over here. And somewhere along the line, I just got addicted to being outside, thinking about my surroundings and caring deeply about them. Really, what my dad gave me was an appreciation for not just enjoying and loving a place, but taking action to help protect it and to see that future generations can enjoy the same privileges that he and I have had in our lifetimes. The Klickitat River is one of the last undammed rivers on the Columbia River system. I think I grew up taking for granted the Columbia River. It's this enormous river that pulses with life. It feeds everything around us. When I started working for Columbia Land Trust, I started to learn what that meant and how significant it was to our economy and to our way of life and to our enjoyment of this region. I feel so fortunate that I can have a role in helping to steward it. I found my life's work here. The Haul Road was built in the Klickitat River to help convey timber from the upper watershed to the mill in Klickitat. The fastest way was where the river was. It's the easiest place to build a road. It's understandable why they chose that location. It's also a highly difficult place to maintain a road because the river is a very powerful force and it's constantly trying to erode. And in 1996, it was successful when the floods wiped out major portions of the road, made it impassable.
By 2004, we secured our first grant that allowed us to buy the Hall Road. It's a privately owned road, the only built infrastructure in the entire corridor. So it represented a really important and unique opportunity to restore this habitat.
I think what makes this project special, there's 20-some thousand acres of public land along this corridor and no houses, no other roads. The potential for something that truly approximates restoration is much greater. I saw it also as a unique opportunity on the landscape.
This project in particular involved a lot of hydrology, a lot of complex concepts that Columbia Land Trust was not necessarily an expert in. And so we partnered with the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program. They would design the project and we would help to implement the process.
Basically, we're reshaping the earth. We're moving the rocks in the soil and creating the room for the river that it once had.
The more diverse the river is and the more it's able to carve out unique habitats like backwater channels and side channels and gravel bars and pools, those features each support different aspects of a fish's life history. So they're really important to have that diversity of features on the landscape, and the removal of the road is going to allow the river to develop that diversity of habitat.
To see how Columbia Land Trust has taken that vision and run with it, and to be confident in their ability to provide that stewardship into the future. It was what I was hoping to see in a project partner.
We've been hiring mostly local crews to implement the project. All the money this project is generating is going back into this community.
We employ 70 people right here in the heart of the gorge. Crestline has engaged in working the nighttime hours to accommodate other user groups on the river. We just don't have that many opportunities as a heavy civil construction company to participate in projects that are sort of reversing time and time's impact. It's awesome for our company. It's a feel-good project for us.
The Klickitat River Restoration Project is about habitat for fish. It's about habitat for people. I think these types of landscapes, these wild places, are really critical places for us to help support a fishery that people's lives depend on. That people, as we speak, are fishing downstream, pulling fish out of the river for a lot of different uses, some of them recreational, some of them commercial.
The food will come back, so not for us, but somebody down the line, as we say, the next generation. The model for our project, for our program is we don't work for ourselves, we work for the generations to come. So that's why we do this.
The changes in the river are already occurring. It happened right here. We worked all night, and literally the next afternoon, there were drift boats anchored up and fishermen hooking fish in an area that had been road filled for the last 80 years.
As of 2015, we've removed 5 of 8 miles that will be removed, and we aim to complete this project next year in 2016. There's so many reasons to love the Pacific Northwest. I think it's hard to spend time outside and not form an attachment to the place you live.
That's a big one.
One of the most gratifying and rewarding gifts that I was given as a child was being in the outdoors. And being able to replicate that for my own children in this really powerful way. It's heavenly.
So that is just one of the many stories that we can tell about the work of Columbia Land Trust. We've conserved more than 50,000 acres from the Pacific Ocean to the Columbia Plateau and East Cascades, and engaged in a great many restoration projects that address limiting factors like that. And we've involved an even greater number of people, advisors and stakeholders, volunteers, neighbors, school groups, researchers, community leaders in those projects too. Our work is described in our conservation agenda, which can be found on our website, and I'll share that address with you at the end of the presentation. So from the time I joined the Land Trust in 2002, when we were just 7, we've grown to a staff of more than 40. And through that growth, we've really managed to adhere to important organizational values that shape our work. We try to listen and respond to the values and concerns of the communities that we work in. We're thoughtful about how we can support rural communities that we work in by hiring local contractors and voluntarily paying property taxes. Honoring historical land uses like hunting and fishing and ranching. And we're actively working to address bias and racism in our work, making policy and forming partnerships with organizations and tribal governments that help to elevate underrepresented voices and improve tribal access for harvested first foods and medicines on our protected lands. So I don't have to tell you that we live in an incredible place, from the estuaries and rainforests and beaches of the Pacific coast to rivers and streams and wetlands of the Willamette Valley, to the biodiverse woodlands and grasslands of the Columbia Plateau. And the work of Columbia Land Trust across the region really underscores the absolutely unparalleled richness of the Pacific Northwest. And this map shows within our range of Columbia Land Trust service area where we're really focusing our efforts. We call those our conservation opportunity areas. But as climate change continues to exert pressure on other parts of the United States, our population is expected to double over the next 25 years. And that's going to put tremendous pressure on our lands, water, and wildlife. And it will be hard for us to prioritize the lives of the voiceless as these pressures mount. What will happen to salmon and steelhead as our rivers warm, or obscure but really lovely creatures like the large mountain salamander or the Oregon forest snail, critters very people care about or can name or even notice. Naming is something that my kids and I talk about sometimes, just the importance of names. It's very difficult to care about something if you don't know that it exists. Bitterroot, beautiful little flower that grows in the cracks of bedrock in the very dry Columbia Plateau. This little impossibility is an important first food to the Rock Creek Band of the Yakama Nation. Or bighead clover with its big clunky name, but its really graceful appearance, or the western fence lizard with its iridescent belly, or the thicket hairstreak butterfly. Here it's perched on those perky little blossoms of buckwheat. Or this mountain goat, which traversed half the state of Oregon before finding some cliffs that it liked on Columbia Land Trust logging camp natural area on the Klickitat River. Or this Lewis's woodpecker, one of the only woodpecker species that doesn't actually peck, but catches its prey in the air. Or the western screech owl, who just frankly, in my opinion, deserves an audience. These are just a few of the hundreds of species who call our region home, likely thousands. We share our home with these organisms, and as our tribal friends would say, these are our brothers and our sisters, and I can tell you the more time I spend with them, the more I fall in love and the more curious I become. These photos on the left are of a pin lichen that a botanist collected off an old-growth Oregon white oak tree on one of our natural areas. And I gotta say, I love botanists. They do crazy things. This one carted home a sample of lichen that she hadn't seen before on a foot-long piece of stick in a shoebox. She dissected it and photographed it under a microscope and then sent those photos to mycologists in Victoria, Canada, who referred her to Washington State University, who referred her to University of Washington, who referred her to a Finnish herbarium in Helsinki, until finally she sent it to the herbarium at the University of Washington, where she hopes one day it will be successfully identified. When it's this hard to identify something, people start getting pretty excited. Like, ooh, are we looking at a new species? Probably. Incidentally, the tree on the right there has another really rare lichen on it, that only develops when the tree bark reaches 300 or 400 years old. What it does in the meantime, I don't know, but I am very curious. So I really appreciate the scale on which biodiversity presents itself. You know, what little we understand of the microscopic and how little we pay attention to it. I was standing on one of our natural areas talking to a group of advisors, and I was kind of absently picking at the loose bark that was peeling away from an oak tree when a bat, which had taken shelter for the day in the space created by that loose bark, flew off. I'm sure not a little inconvenienced. And these galls right here on the lower left that look like apples, they're the tree's response to being chewed on by wasps. And the tissue that creates actually encases and protects the insect larva within. It's a reproductive strategy of these wasps. And it doesn't hurt the oak. And it's this immune response to the injury ensures the survival of one of hundreds of insects that live in and rely on oak systems. And that drives this extreme biodiversity that oak systems present in our region. And you'll notice that I'm starting to zero in a little bit on Oregon white oak, and there's a reason for that. For about 15 years, I was a natural area manager of about 12,000 acres of conserved land on the Klickitat River over here east of Hood River. The Klickitat River originates on Mount Adams and the Goat Rocks Wilderness, and it flows into the Columbia River by Lyle, Washington. And in my opinion, it is the best kept secret in the Pacific Northwest. So the reason I love the Klickitat so much is that it exists in this really fascinating ecological transition zone between the crest of the Cascade Mountains to the west and the Columbia Plateau to the east. And this zone goes from over 11,000 feet at the top of the volcanoes, the crest of the Cascades, to less than 180 feet on the Columbia River, and from 120 inches of precipitation annually to less than 10, over a linear distance of only about 40 miles. And I have not been able to find in scouring elevation and precipitation heat maps of the globe anywhere on Earth where these two traits combine in this way. And when you add in the Columbia River Gorge, things get really exciting. The relatively warm and moist maritime air from the Pacific Ocean flows through the gorge and collides with colder, drier continental air mass on the Columbia Plateau. And that creates a plume in the East Cascades of unique climate conditions that generates also unique niche habitats. It gives rise to a number of endemic species that only occur in this area. And it allows a Mediterranean plant like the Oregon white oak to grow east of the mountains. Oregon white oak is one of Columbia Land Trust's conservation priorities because in addition to being one of the most productive host trees of biodiversity in the world, they're also fire adapted and they're incredibly resilient to disturbance. The East Cascades is home to a large extent of habitat that's relatively unfragmented, especially compared to places like the Willamette Valley, where some estimate fewer than 5% of historic oak habitat still persists. So we have opportunity. And when I started working at the Land Trust, I drove into the Klickitat for the first time in the spring when the crowns of the trees were green and the hills were full of wildflowers, and I fell in love. And I do that a lot, you'll notice. I fell in love with the landscape, but we were also preparing at the time for a major restoration project, and we'd hired a consulting forestry outfit to help us install monitoring plots. And that is when I met one of the foresters that we'd hired, and I literally fell in love, and I married him in the oaks on the bluffs overlooking the natural area where we met. So there it is again, family, land trust. It's hard for me to tease them apart. So Jeremy and I were installing permanent vegetation monitoring plots. That's what these numbers are in this map here on the left, which allow us to track changes in oak woodlands over time and determine whether our restoration treatments were taking us closer or farther away from the desired future condition, which in the case of this restoration project was to enhance stand structure for wildlife and reduce risk of wildfire. Since people began suppressing fires 100 years or so ago in earnest, we also suppressed the governing ecological processes that these systems are adapted to. Fires, in this case, it burned on average every 5 to 25 years. And these fires may have been started by people, but there are also a great many lightning ignitions in this region in the late summer. And early written observations note that there was a persistent smoky haze over the region for much of the summer and fall. So we know that fires were very common, and we know that also based on the stories that we hear from tribal elders. European immigrants also deployed sheep and cattle to graze the understories of oaks when the more productive valleys and grasslands were converted to agriculture in the early 1900s. And that changed how plants did or did not reproduce. Spring is when nutrition from growing grasses is most concentrated and plant fibers are most palatable to livestock. So it makes sense that that's when ranchers would graze their animals on this landscape. And oak woodlands are also the first to shed snow in the spring because oaks are concentrated at lower elevations. So they also were grazed earlier or first in the spring. But spring is also when our native plants in the understory are trying to flower and reproduce. So being regularly cropped by grazing puts a serious damper on their ability to do that. And so the landscape has slowly transitioned to hardier plants, usually invasive ones like cheatgrass or other weedy species. Unlike native perennial bunchgrass communities, and as their name suggests, bunchgrasses grow in bunches, and you can see that on the left side of the screen here. Then there's space in between the plants. But these annual grasses, which are pictured on the right, grow in dense mats or thatches. And those mats prevent the establishment of flowering forbs. They also prevent burrowing insects, like 70% of our native bee species, and small mammals from utilizing the bare ground that occurs in between bunch grasses. And they also die back earlier in the year, forming these highly flammable, really dense, uninterrupted fuel beds, which change the way that fires burn in this landscape as well. And the birds and the reptiles and the mammal diversity all follow, they decline. This is a video I took while sitting in an annual grass-dominated meadow on one of our natural areas. And you can still see there's a few bunch grasses in here. There's some Lomatium nudicale, which is a bare stem desert parsley, which is tolerant of disturbance. You find it a lot along roadbeds. But let's just, when I hit go on this video, take in the textures and the sounds and the number of times I get buzzed by something with wings. And then we're going to go sit somewhere else. So let's check it out. So, pretty peaceful and quiet. It's lovely. But now let's go to a different spot. So a little more lively. You get the picture, more texture, more activity, more sounds in the second spot. And that's the difference between an intact plant community and an annual grass invaded plant community. And you can literally see and hear what a difference oversimplification of habitat can make. And that's just at this scale. You think about how that works at a landscape or at a global scale, and it's really quite frightening. So as we interacted in the oak landscape more over the years, we came to understand and appreciate them in new ways. And we started to experiment with fire and thinning and herbicide and seeding to try to reverse the impacts of fire suppression and intensive or persistent spring grazing. And we started asking questions like, do mature oak canopies, like this one, create conditions of a nursery of sorts for the next generation of oak? Or is this an example of how germinating acorns can grow unchecked in the absence of regular returning fires? Is this healthy or not healthy? Is it safe or not safe? Are these little oaks growing up under the crowns of these larger oaks going to become the next generation of large oaks? Or are they going to carry a wildfire when one does inevitably occur into the crown of the older oaks and burn it all down? Oaks are remarkably resilient plants. They have these buds in their root crowns, which are located below ground, that will initiate or sprout if the crown of the tree is burned by a fire, or in this case, cut by a saw, or damaged by wind. And you can see I dug the soil away here to show that these sprouts come from the root crown of this cut stump. And those stump sprouts will grow into a bush and then into a ring of small trees if they escape grazing pressure, until they essentially grow together into what sometimes appears to be one large tree. And that's a good thing in a landscape expecting to grow hotter and drier and windier in the future. It suggests that oaks will resprout after burning, providing forage and acorns and shade, even in their shrubbier growth forms. But if they're locked into that process of burning and sprouting and burning again, single stem trees may grow more limited in this landscape over time. And the single stem trees are particularly valuable, especially the larger ones, for habitat because oaks are hollow inside. And as they drop limbs, the scars they leave behind become doorways for wildlife to escape predators and make nests deep in the bottom of the stem of the tree. And these features are less common in tree morphologies that have multiple stems that have grown together. Western gray squirrels use these oak cavities as their natal dens. There's some adorable babies there. But there is one way in which oak trees are not resilient, and that is in the shadows of larger, taller conifer trees. They are shade intolerant. Douglas fir is not as fire tolerant as oak, especially when they're younger. So historically, in this landscape, when fires were burning regularly, conifers would be killed as seedlings, and oaks could develop into mature trees. But as the fires were regularly suppressed, conifers survived, overtopping and eventually killing mature oak, which cannot compete with conifer for sunlight. Oaks will drop limb after limb in an attempt to maximize vertical growth, like this tree did on the right. And the tree on the left will probably do something similar over the next 50 years or so, as it tries to outcompete the conifers for light. But ultimately, the oaks lose the race and die. And this is why conifer encroachment is one of the highest threats in the East Cascades Oak Partnership strategic plan. And I'll tell you more about that shortly. And why we're working with partners to remove conifers where they're overtopping these legacy oaks. Another way conifers can become a threat is because people have a preference for trees that are commercially valuable. So they actively replace oak with conifers. We're working on conservation easement strategies right now that will provide financial incentives to forest landowners to refrain from spraying or cutting oak in favor of Douglas fir. And one project we're actively developing would do that on thousands of acres of oak habitat east of Hood River. Another really important aspect of Oregon white oak trees is the acorns they produce. These little buggers are notorious for ending up in the pockets of my children, probably mothers and fathers everywhere. Children tend to cache these seeds as ambitiously as jays do. Jays can disperse thousands of acorns in their lifetimes, and they even have specialized beaks that help them carry acorns. They cache the acorns and inevitably they'll forget about some of them. So those acorns can survive to germinate. And this has been an evolutionarily honed symbiosis that serves both oaks and jays. Another really cool aspect of acorn production is masting. Masting is when oaks kind of chug along, producing a similar size crop each year, and then suddenly, boom, they make a ton. And you can see the peaks in production on the graphs in the upper right. Predators like jays and woodpeckers and squirrels and bears and deer and all sorts of small mammals simply can't eat them all when masting events occur. So many acorns survive to germinate during a masting year if the subsequent climate conditions support germination and establishment. Acorns are awesome little power packs for wildlife. They're the richest source of plant protein in the woods and packing enough nutrients that good masting years can drive population booms in deer and other mammals and birds. So deer can even produce twins, or they often do produce twins following an acorn masting event. Another cool fact about masting is that it happens synchronously across the extent of oak distribution. So from Northern California to Southern British Columbia, on the west side of the Cascades and the east side, oaks follow a similar masting pattern. There's a researcher named Dr. David Peter at the Pacific Northwest Research Station who found that masting phenomenon follow dry springs and cold falls. And so the wet spring last year is the reason acorn crop was aborted in the East Cascades this fall. It was simply too wet, too long through that spring period for wind pollination to occur, and the acorns failed to develop. Also, interestingly, shown in the blue table on the bottom right, acorn production by oaks along east side streams in the East Cascades was the highest observed acorn production across the Pacific Northwest during the study period, followed by upland oaks in the gorge and Klickitat. So that's kind of cool. When acorns do germinate, they aggressively put down taproots. Sometimes the crown of an established seedling, the part that's above ground, will stay just inches tall for decades as the taproot develops before the tree invests in the upward growth. And between that fact of biology and the stump sprouting habit, I suspect there may be oaks in our landscape with young crowns that might have taproots that are many thousands of years old. No one has really measured that to my knowledge. So these oak systems are biodiverse and they're resilient, but they also provide shade to people and livestock. They support culturally important species like deer and elk and bear and turkey, first foods and medicines that are important to American Indians, and they make incredible firewood because they're so dense. They also were used by the Yakima people to make digging sticks and grinding bowls. Elders would send children out into the woods to tie oak saplings into knots. And then the knowledge of where those knotted trees were located would be passed down until 100 years later, the knotted wood would be harvested. And you can see an example of the knotted wood in that photo on the right. And then the knot would be carved into a grinding bowl, which is pictured on the left. And the bowls would be used for grinding acorns into flour, among other things. And incidentally, they last about 100 years before breaking apart. And so the cycle would continue. So the Land Trust launched a partnership with funding from Pacific Birds and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And the East Cascades Oak Partnership was born. The East Cascades Oak Partnership has this vision that oak habitats are abundant and diverse and healthy throughout the region, and that they support rich biodiversity and human uses for generations to come. And we empower people to make decisions and take actions that improve outcomes for Oregon white oak systems. And I'm going to tell you more about how we do that in a minute. Our partnership has 17 core partners who've signed a declaration of cooperation, including the Yakima Nation and the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the U.S. Forest Service, NRCS, local soil and water conservation districts, state wildlife and forestry agencies in both Oregon and Washington, Oregon State Parks. There's several land trusts and an organization called the Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture. And so in addition to our core partners, we're regularly joined by small businesses, researchers, and graduate students, people from extension offices, and a slew of private landowners who managed to stay engaged through 3 years of strategic planning. And that sounds dry, but it wasn't all planning. Our planning process involved learning tours. We heard from more than 60 presenters on a wide variety of topics about the oak landscape, including grazing and forestry and wine production and planning rules and regulations and oak biology and ecology, associated species, fire, restoration, cultural history, kind of goes on and on. And the reason that we chose to focus on that learning was that it helped us build a shared base of understanding about the oak landscape. And it helped partners coalesce around a vision for how we're going to help improve outcomes for oak systems and the people who live and work and play in them. ECOP, that's short for East Cascade Oak Partnership, isn't the only oak partnership that's out there in the Pacific Northwest. There's actually 9 of us, and we're now all collaborating under the banner of a shared business plan to promote public awareness of oaks and help shape policy that can catalyze oak conservation and restoration at the state level. So what is ECOP doing at the local level? So much. We provide services, so we're facilitating networking and coordination among partners. We help catalyze our partner mission work through funding development and project support. We provide letters of support to partners implementing priority work. We provide learning opportunities through meetings and tours and events. We implement priority actions that lack an established partner lead. So we have now 3 ECOP dedicated staff at Columbia Land Trust who work on the priority strategies that no one else was advancing, kind of like a capacity building service. And then we also have been developing a number of tools that can help our partners make better decisions in the oak landscape. Those include our strategic plan and a summary document. We actually commissioned a historian from the National Park Service to collate a landscape history of Oregon white oak in the East Cascades. There were a lot of questions about historical condition of oaks in the East Cascades. There's not a lot of published literature, not a lot of peer-reviewed science. And so we felt like we were operating a little bit in the dark. And that was one of the strategies that we used to help learn more about our landscape. We also did a communications assessment among stakeholders to learn more about how people prefer to be communicated with about the oak landscape. And we developed some outreach tools to help partners give messages to the community. We have a funding guidance document that partners can draw from that helps identify sources of funding to implement priority strategies. We created a classification system for oaks. As I mentioned earlier, the landscape is really complex and diverse because of those different climate gradients. And so no 2 oak systems are very much alike. And that means that our management lessons from one site may or may not apply at a different site. And being able to describe that diversity and name the diverse types or name the ways that those oak systems present is a really important part of our ability to communicate about oak systems. We also did a lot of modeling and mapping because similarly to the research situation, there was not a strong spatial understanding of how oaks were distributed and growing across the East Cascades. So we mapped not just the extent of oak systems, but also how they're being utilized by people. We also created a standardized monitoring tool that all the partners can deploy on their restoration projects that will help build a better data set to inform management. And then we're in the process of building an ecological integrity assessment tool, which is a mouthful, but that's going to help us prioritize projects for conservation and restoration and help partners kind of work through how past land management decisions have impacted the current condition of oak systems, and then develop better management going forward. And so we're also developing some management guidance tools that can help partners make better informed decisions. So this is an example of one of the outreach pieces that we produced that partners now have on display in their offices and that we can hand out at events to help people understand some of the conservation values of the oak landscape at kind of a really high level. And this is our strategic plan. It's a 150-page beast that you can find on our website, or if you like lighter reading, you can click on a link I'll provide at the end of the presentation for a summary of the strategic plan and get through it in just a few minutes. During strategic planning, we built our plan to address ecological limiting factors that presented highest threats to oak systems, but we structured our planning around common human interactions with the oak landscape. And we did that because oaks are concentrated at lower elevations where people are also concentrated. And so we're really inextricable from the ecology of oaks, and we have been for millennia. So we need to participate in the solutions. And these are the 6 kind of high-level primary ways that people interact with the oak landscape. Rural residential development, we build and live in homes here. Fire suppression and conversion to conifers, we put fires out and we cut oaks down. We allow conifer to proliferate in historic oak habitat. Grazing, we deploy our domestic livestock to grow food for ourselves, and that impacts the understory plants and pollinators that live here. We convert oaks to vineyards and orchards. I love drinking wine. Wine grapes love soils that oaks grow on. We recreate, we build trails and hike and hunt, and we bird and we play in the oaks. And then ecological stewardship and first foods. We do restoration, sometimes with really intensive disturbances like prescribed fire or logging or herbicide application. And that has impacts on oak systems that we also need to understand. And then we also harvest first fruits from the oak landscape. At the same time, during strategic planning, we mapped the extent of oak and we started wrestling with those spatial priorities for conservation and restoration. There aren't any federally endangered species in the oak landscape yet, and we are far removed from access to universities. So we've been underserved by research, but we're beginning to change that through ECOP's efforts. And to help discern spatial priorities in this data poor environment, we created a model that prioritized large patch sizes and higher levels of oak system diversity and understory condition and predicted climate resilience as mapped by the Nature Conservancy in 2015, and the predicted or actual presence of rare, threatened, or endangered species. And then we reviewed those model results with our partners, and we adopted priority areas where we would concentrate ECOP's resources and attentions. But we also recognized the importance of connectivity to climate resilience. So we identified in purple corridors across which we'd like to maintain connectivity, and those extend across north-south gradients, across elevation gradients and precipitation gradients. And theoretically, this will help allow species to adapt to changing conditions if we can maintain connectivity across those corridors. So then for each of those 6 human behaviors, we also identified the contributing factors to how people make decisions in the oak landscape. We ranked them for how significantly they impact the oak landscape. And then we generated ideas for how to change them. And we took our thinking through these logic models, which I don't expect you to read, called results chains. And these help us identify gaps in our strategies. Then we prioritized the strategies and we adopted a strategic plan. And I love this example for rural residential development because it shows how powerful some of our spatial data sets that went into our planning efforts are. Here you can see a heat map where people and structures are concentrated in the oak landscape on the left. And then in the middle is a map showing where parcels are smaller. So the darker the shade, the more fragmented by a larger number of smaller parcels. And then the map on the right shows where potential new structures could be built based on zoning allowances. And you can see here in living color the differences between Washington and Oregon's land use planning systems. So believe it, they're powerful. Here's another example of fire suppression and conifer encroachment. The map shows where we think oaks might be at risk of being overtopped by conifers based on soil and vegetation types and climate. In the photo over here, you can see a before and after of one of Columbia Land Trust projects that we implemented on the Little White Salmon River. And you can see we left a number of mature conifer in the post-restoration condition, but we really improved light to the oaks that were struggling under that denser forest canopy. And we left conifers because there are a number of really large old growth pine and fir scattered throughout the area. And so we understood the stand to be more of a mixed oak and conifer type stand that was just suffering from fire suppression. So the partnership transitioned to implementation of our strategic plan 2 years ago, and we're having some really wonderful successes. We were awarded a Focused Investment Partnership grant by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board last year. It's a $7 million funding allocation that will help us implement our strategic plan in Oregon. We had 880 different bodies attend ECOP events last year, and that included 4 of our kind of standard partnership meetings where we have presenters and we talk about our conservation restoration strategies. We had 6 field tours, some of them built around contrasting wildfire and prescribed burn events. And then we had a couple of community events. We also held 2 workshops. We were helping build the skills that our partners have in plant identification, which really is kind of a core aspect of good management, getting back to that concept of naming things, knowing that they exist and what they respond to. And then we established a few new research collaborations that are going to help us address some of our key management questions. Our partners, in the meantime, with support from the partnership, implemented some really powerful projects in the oak landscape. The Columbia River Gorge Commission created a climate action plan. Our Oregon partners funded and are implementing major restoration projects through Senate Bill 762, which was a fire-oriented legislation, and then through Joint Chiefs collaborations. Those are big funding projects that can fund federal government. And then the NRCS and our local conservation districts have been implementing some forest health and oak conservation incentive program funding. And they're also working on updating their ecological site descriptions, which is really foundational to our ability to describe that oak system diversity and incorporate that into our management tools. The Yakima Nation was funded for $2.5 million through America the Beautiful Challenge Grant Program for oak restoration and acquisition. And Columbia Land Trust was awarded several $1 million of funding through the Washington Wildlife Recreation Program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Grant Program, and we have submitted a forest legacy application to prevent working lands from being converted for development, and that help prevent oak from being harvested or actively converted to conifers in that area east of Hood River that I mentioned earlier. Mount Adams Resource Stewards and Sustainable Northwest and Columbia Land Trust have been promoting the creation of a prescribed burn association south of Mount Adams. This is a concept that would help remove barriers to burning, using fire as a tool, as a management tool on private lands in our region. And then our partners at the Washington DNR did some major oak release work this year as a result of their learning that they did through the partnership. And the Natural Heritage Program is helping to support the creation of our current condition assessment tool. And then Pacific Birds is coordinating the launch of a new statewide effort to promote oak awareness among the public. And so really there's a lot getting done, and it's really inspiring. And so I encourage you to head to our website to learn more about Columbia Land Trust Conservation Agenda or the Oak Partnership. We're just now working on a more robust website for the partnership, so don't expect too much there, but you can read our strategic plan. You know, ECOP has been a really powerful manifestation of Columbia Land Trust Conservation Agenda. It's an approach that really centers people and relationships in solving complex ecological problems and in protecting priority resources. And we're doing similar work across the extent of our service area. So if you would like to become part of our community and support that approach to conservation, I would welcome you to make a donation through our website. And I just really appreciate your time in hearing my story today. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was a beautiful, moving, and informative presentation today. Outstanding job. And we had the privilege of watching you grow up in 50 minutes on video there. We saw basically your entire life. Very enjoyable. I see a question from Willie in the chat, and I will get to that momentarily, but I'll go ahead and ask the first question. One thing I take away from your presentation today is the number of variables you have to balance with plants and animal species, as well as human stakeholders. And with all of those groups involved, what would you say is one of the more difficult decisions you've been involved with the Columbia Land Trust?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, I can harken back to that Hall Road restoration project, the one that we watched the video about. That project was a perfect example of how difficult it is to balance all the variables. We have, we were digging in the main stem of the Klickitat River. And usually when you're doing something like that, it's because you're building a road. You're not removing a road. So you put these big curtains in the river that prevent sediments from entering the water column. But we were removing access. So we couldn't put iron curtains in the river because there was no way to take them out again. And so the agencies that were involved in our permitting decided to allow our project to generate turbidity in favor of getting the road out of the floodplain. And what that did, though, was it clouded the river during sometimes the peak times for fishing. And if any of you are fishermen, you know that it's really difficult to catch fish when the water is really turbid. And so that generated a lot of conflict between fishermen and commercial guide services and the project. And so we had to undertake a lot of public outreach. We actually shifted our implementation timing to do construction in evenings, so that by the time fishermen were getting on the river in the morning, some of that plume had traveled downstream away from the more popular fishing spots. And one of the tools that I developed to help explain to our different stakeholder groups in that project was this table that laid out all the different variables that we have to balance. So it's things like, when we can be operating equipment near this peregrine falcon nest, and when we can be digging in the water during salmon spawning events, and when we can actually get grass seed to grow, or when we can functionally dig in soils, right? In the winter, they freeze solid and you just can't dig. So there were all these different variables when people were fishing, when people were hiking, when people were hunting. and so there was a great many variables. And when you map them all out by month and you show people there is not a convenient time to do this project, that was a really powerful communication tool that helped people understand that their interest was one among many, and that we were working really hard to try to resolve those conflicts.
Thank you. I'm letting our audience know that I see your questions. Hank, I see your hand up. I know that Al is there at the Friendly House, but our first question comes, and I see you there, Jules. We've got a lot of participation in our Q&A session today, and we'll start that with Willie from our Zoom audience.
I've been told that it's predicted because of climate change that the Douglas fir are within 50 years, it won't be healthy enough to live here. Is that going to help the oaks if they die out, or will the same thing that is going to affect the fir trees going to affect the oak trees also? So are we planting all these oak trees that won't even survive 50 years?
Yeah, oaks are really drought tolerant and they're very hardy. And so I expect that even under a warming climate with changing precipitation regimes, that oak are going to do fine.
Oh, good. That's good news. Isn't that good news?
Yeah, that's great news. And it's not such great news about Douglas fir, but Douglas fir have a really diverse genome. So they have this ability to exist in a lot of different kinds of environments, and they've adapted to a lot of climate change over their life history. And so I'm hopeful that some of our models and some of our thinking around climate change might be disproven and outmaneuvered by nature.
Because we've been told not to plant Douglas firs anymore, like in our home, if we have a park or something, because they don't, it takes them 50 years to get to be huge trees.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, Douglas fir, one of the things that we're learning they're really impacted by drought is not necessarily by the amount of groundwater that they have available, but it's actually the aridity of the air that prevents them from being able to photosynthesize to the extent that will help support them through their life.
And oaks don't have that issue. Is that true?
Oaks don't have that same issue.
Oh,
yeah.
Good.
Okay, I try and alternate as best I can between our Zoom audience and our Friendly House audience. And with that, we go to Al Christians at the Friendly House with a question.
Yes, you mentioned consumer awareness of oak, and I have about 3 questions about that. I'll give them to you really quick about 3 aspects of that maybe we could get oaks more involved in our life back here in the city in Portland. First is I've read, I think I read someplace that although acorns are not normally edible by humans, the native people had some way that they could make them edible. And are these a potential good health food or some consumer product that would get people planting more oaks? Is there some way that we could try to popularize those as a food? The other two things are, would planting any of these oaks in Portland in our suburban backyards, would that do anything to help these oak trees? Would that, you're going that out there, but should we be thinking about that? And would it help our urban environment? You know, we have some of the mammal species tend to be more problematic in the city, and would it maybe help us solve some of those problems? And what should we do when we see oak products of wood for consumer use? Should we buy them or not buy them, or does it matter?
Good questions. I love it. I'll start with your last one. I think that's a really hard question. You know, anytime you create a market demand for something, you can endanger it, right? If it's harvested unsustainably, or if it's planted in places where, you know, they historically weren't even present as a farming strategy. There's a number of ways that, you know, commercializing a natural resource can backfire. On the other hand, it would maybe create a financial incentive for people to not replace them with more commercially valuable species. There was a paper I read once. I went down to visit a custom sawmill in Central Oregon, and they've saw wood from, you know, all over the place, and they've experimented with how Oregon white oak could be better utilized by different sawing techniques. Oregon white oak, as I mentioned in my presentation, are hollow on the inside. So that really limits what you can do with that species of oak. But there are, you know, 500 different species of oak, and many of them are utilized for hardwood flooring and things like that because they're strong and they're pretty. And you see them a lot in cabinetry and things like that because they're structurally so strong. So there are markets for other species of oak, but not so much for Oregon white oak. As far as planting in your backyard, yes, absolutely. It's a wonderful thing to do. Oak habitats in the Willamette Valley have declined by more than 90% from their historical levels, and they are just these incredible nurseries for biodiversity. And I know that there's a book out called The Nature of Oaks, and we actually had the author present to the East Cascades Oak Partnership in December, and we have that video on Columbia Land Trust YouTube channel. And I really encourage you to go check it out because he's got just incredible statistics about how many invertebrates and bird species and things like that rely on oaks. And he's got some really beautiful pictures. His oak species he was focused on were more kind of eastern seaboard oak species, but it was a really wonderful presentation. But also the Columbia Land Trust has a backyard habitat certification program that actually really encourages people in urban areas to landscape their yards in a way that can provide those really important ecological services. So maintaining snags in your yard, things that are not really very popular in urban environments, planting native plants that flower and support different pollinator species and bird species. And so there's a whole structured certified certification program that's managed between Columbia Land Trust and the Audubon. And so I'd encourage you to look into that if you're interested in participating in getting support in converting your yard into a habitat. Oh, and then the acorn question. Acorns have been utilized extensively by Native peoples for millennia. They are full of tannins, and that's what makes them kind of hard for people to process and wildlife sometimes. But you can soak them. You leach all those tannins out by soaking them. They used to create these pits along rivers and streams, and they would put the acorns in there to soak for many days, and then they would come back and pull them out and roast them. And one elder from the Warm Springs told me they were his favorite snack. They used to just have a container of them by the door, and as he was running out, he just grab a scoop, kind of like nuts, you know, and eat them after they were leached like that. And then you can grind them into flour and you can make things with them. And I have never tried eating acorn flour, but I have friends who have. It's not particularly tasty, you know. It was a really great source of protein for people when there were no grocery stores. I think it'd be hard to make an argument for it against things like wheat flour or almond flour or some of those tastier types of flours, but you can certainly eat it.
Sporting his blue hens attire, we go to Hank Robb in our Zoom audience.
Yes, thank you so much for this very entertaining as well as informative presentation. I'm a fishing nut, and that has connected me to the Western Rivers Conservancy, which their motto is, sometimes to preserve a river, you have to buy it. So I'm interested in the sort of financial aspect of this. What they tend to do is they borrow money to buy something, then they get a state entity to buy it from them, which gives them money to buy something else again. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm trying to, now one of the things that happens if it goes into the state is I think it's not paying property taxes anymore. Mm-hmm. One of the things you were talking about was paying the property taxes, and you said voluntarily. So can you tell me about how does all the financing of this thing work?
Yeah, so, you know, over time, we have built a strong diversity of funding sources. And, you know, our operating expenses are supported by donations, by our membership, by private foundations. And then some of our staff expenses can be covered by different grants that we write to support implementation of project work. And some of that project work is restoration based, like what I described, and a lot of it is acquisition based. So putting in place whatever kind of ownership instrument we feel is going to advance the conservation values most successfully. And those instruments can include conservation easements, where we literally buy a bundle of rights or are donated a bundle of rights by the landowner. They remain the landowner. We monitor the property to make sure that the rights that we have taken ownership of, like development rights, for example, are not violated. And so we have a forever obligation to maintain and monitor those easements. But the landowner will continue to live there or work there if it's an active forestry type easement or if it's an agricultural easement. And so the land continues to support the economic activity that it traditionally supported, but in a way that will prevent future conversion to other uses. And then in the case of our acquisitions, we write a lot of grants to fund those purchases. And then we've also been building a stewardship endowment that helps to fund restoration in the long term. So we have kind of these baseline, what we call our priority one stewardship actions. Those are things like making sure our boundaries aren't encroached on by neighbors, making sure that we are controlling noxious weeds, that we're paying taxes, that we're responding to neighbor concerns, that we're maintaining our boundaries. And those are just kind of like the baseline stewardship obligations. And then for everything else, we write funding proposals to do large-scale restoration projects that might help recover ecological processes or habitat conditions over time. Some of the considerations that we give, like in our voluntary payment of taxes, we do that mostly in the rural areas that we work because our rural communities are largely supported by the land base. And so if in the Klickitat River, for example, we have 12,000 acres that we own and manage. And we voluntarily pay taxes because that's a pretty significant amount of land. And it's a pretty significant source of funding for the county for, you know,
why is that voluntary? Why wouldn't you have to pay them anyway if you own the land?
Yeah, because we're a nonprofit, and so the state of Washington and state of Washington has an exemption program, and so historically, when we first started, if we owned land, we would write an application to the state, and they would exempt us from having to pay property taxes. That was kind of an incentive program that was put in place by Washington voters to try to help conserve open space and habitat. And so in those rural communities, that was a really important part of earning trust and credibility and responding to those local concerns.
That was a great question, Hank. And one reason I know it was a great question is it was also Jeff's question at the Friendly House. So we got a 2-for-1 there. So let's conclude our, we have 2 questions left. I think we can get to them both. Let's go to Kathy Moyd with her question.
Yeah, okay. My question is, there's a lot of federal money and hopefully state money available, especially with respect to sequestration of carbon. And it seems like a lot of what you do may actually be in that vein. So are you working on trying to get some of that money?
Yeah, Kathy, thank you for asking that question. We actually recently launched a pretty ambitious program with funding from some private foundations and from the government called Natural Climate Solutions. And a lot of our lands have been enrolled, and we're actively managing our forests with that as one of our primary goals. And so whenever we think about treatments for forest health, or when we're advancing a conservation project, we are building in that climate resilience piece into our planning. And we're hopeful that, that program is going to also create a place for local people to locally offset their carbon impact, their footprint.
Now, Jules, you had your hand up earlier. I assume you still have a question.
Well, I do have a question. It's comments also. I live on the periphery of Mount Tabor Park, which is wall-to-wall Douglas firs. We have not touched the backyard. There are 4 big Douglas firs back there. Everything is allowed to grow. Raccoons live back there, squirrels, whatever. And it's my way of feeling that I'm still part of the park. Historically, Douglas fir is named after Douglas, who brought the seeds from Scotland and planted Douglas firs in this country. So if you want to go back to the Audubon Society as to what's endemic, in order to get certified, and I got turned down because I had too much wild ivy back here, they wouldn't certify me. So is the oak endemic? Does it have that advantage over this Douglas fir?
Yeah, and there's a lot of evidence for Douglas fir having been on this continent for many millennia, but there's Oregon white oak as a species is 35 million years old. And so it's been around for a while. And we think it entered the East Cascades through the Columbia River Gorge, that was its kind of corridor after the major flooding events that created the Columbia River Gorge. So yeah, it's got a long genetic history in our region, and it's survived a lot of different fluctuations in climate, which is one reason I feel kind of hopeful for its ability to navigate whatever changes are coming.
Well, one final comment. It's mainly the canopy of the Douglas fir that is the issue, because it impedes the growth of oak. Why can't the canopy cut back? So the diversity of nature is still there. You have Douglas firs and you have oaks living together, and the Douglas firs are not impinging on the oak survival.
Yep, that's a strategy that many of us use. So we sometimes will just top Douglas fir to create a snag where otherwise it might shade out these mature oaks. Right. And then there's lots of cases where we try to thin the conifer. So we're still leaving many of them because they provide important habitat benefits in and of themselves. But try to kind of strategically release the Oregon white oak, especially on the south and eastern sides of the oak trees, which is where they get most of their light. So there are definitely some ways to be strategic in how to balance Douglas fir with Oregon white oak. But it would be nice if Douglas fir were just like, hey, there's an oak down here, and like lifted its skirts,
Okay, thanks so much for your good work.
You bet. Thank you.
I think